11, Clause 2, H4, the chairman may postpone further proceedings today on any question of approving any measure or matter on adopting an amendment of which a recorded vote of the yeas and nays are ordered. I'd ask unanimous consent that the chairman be authorized to declare recess at any time during today's meeting. Without objection, that's so ordered. Whole bill and amendment texts have been distributed electronically, and paper copies are also available here in the hearing room if you need one. Today, the committee is considering the authorization and oversight plan for the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure for the 118th Congress, the fiscal year 2024 views and estimates of the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure. We also have House Resolution 152 supporting the goals and ideals of move-over laws, House Concurrent Resolution 15 authorizing the use of the Capitol grounds for the National Peace Officers Memorial Service and the National Honor Guard and Pipe Band Exhibition. We also have H.R. 783 designating the Department of Energy Integrated Engineering Research Center Federal Building located at the Fermi National Accelerator Laboratory in Batavia, Illinois, as the Helen Edwards Engineering Research Center. 10 General Services Administration capital investment and leasing program resolutions, which 2 of which address needed repairs and 8 for leases themselves. House Joint Resolution 27, providing for congressional disapproval under Chapter 8 of Title 5 United States Code of the Rules submitted by the Department of Army Corps of Engineers, Department of Defense, Environmental Protection Agency relating to revised definition of waters of the United States, and finally, H.R. 1152, the Water Quality Certification and Energy Project Improvement Act of 2023. Finally, I'd ask unanimous consent for the committee to use an amendments roster for any of the items under consideration by the committee, and without objection, that is so ordered. All right. Our first item under consideration is the authorization and oversight plan for the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure for the 118th Congress. I now call up the authorization and oversight plan for consideration. Without objection, the first reading is dispensed with. The authorization and oversight plan is now considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Recognize myself for 5 minutes for a statement on the authorization and oversight plan. So in accordance with Rule 10, House Rule 10, the committee's authorization and oversight plan lays out priority oversight areas for the full committee and all of our subcommittees. As I've said before, this will be a work committee and not going to be a show committee. Not only are we going to advance legislation, but we're going to conduct oversight of issues that fall within this committee's jurisdiction. For example, as Department of Transportation disperses billions of dollars through the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, this committee will closely monitor how the department allocates funds to ensure that full compliance with the law and to make sure that congressional intent is realized. Furthermore, the committee will assess the projects selected for funding to determine whether the department is being effective and responsible stewards of taxpayers' dollars. We worked with Ranking Member Larson to create this plan. While there are some areas where we may take different approaches, we certainly can agree that conducting oversight is a necessary and important function of the committee. This plan creates a roadmap for our oversight activities, and I urge adoption of the committee's authorization and oversight plan. I now recognize Mr. Larson for his statement on the
Mr. Chair, pursuant to House and committee rules, each Congress, the committee adopts an authorization and oversight plan that's submitted to the Committee on Oversight and Accountability and the Committee on House Admin. Oversight activities fulfill a number of purposes. These activities include ensuring executive compliance with legislative intent, improving the efficiency and effectiveness of governmental operations, and assessing agencies' ability to carry out program objectives. The committee is also specifically charged with investigating and eliminating waste, fraud, and abuse and mismanagement. So, Mr. Chair, I want to thank you for working with us in developing the committee's authorization and oversight plan. As you mentioned, the bipartisan infrastructure law, I want to make a note about that. It is the largest investment in transportation and infrastructure that we've made in generations. On our side of the aisle, we welcome all opportunities to oversee these investments because these are dollars that are delivering projects and jobs in communities all across the country, including just this week where there were announcements for $2.4 billion dispersed to communities for clean water projects, nearly $1 billion for 99 airports, and then nearly $185 million for projects to reconnect communities. So with that, Mr. Chairman, appreciate the bipartisan work we did to put this together. I support adoption of the plan. With that, I yield back.
Thanks, Rick. Do any other members wish to be recognized for a statement on the plan? Seeing none, Are there any amendments to the authorization and oversight plan for the Committee on Transportation Infrastructure for the 118th Congress? Hearing none, the question is now on adoption and favorable reporting of the authorization and oversight plan for the Committee on Transportation Infrastructure for the 118th Congress. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The authorization and oversight plan for the Committee on Transportation Infrastructure for the 118th Congress is adopted. Pursuant to Clause 2D1 of Rule 10 of the Rules of the House of Representatives, the authorization and oversight plan will be submitted to the Committee on Oversight and Accountability and the Committee on House Administration. Our next item for consideration is the Committee on Transportation Infrastructure's fiscal year 2024 views and estimates. I now call up the views and estimates, and without objection, the first reading is dispensed with. The views and estimates is now considered as read and open to amendment at any point. I recognize myself for 5 minutes for a statement on the views and estimates. This year, the committee continues to have a very busy agenda, and our legislative priorities include reauthorizing the Federal Aviation Administration as well as the Coast Guard and passing a pipeline safety bill. The committee will also prioritize oversight and hold the administration accountable for its policies. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, enacted last Congress, provided $1.2 trillion, roughly half of which went towards programs under this committee's jurisdiction. Despite this historic funding, persistent inflation and ongoing supply chain challenges continue to dilute the law's funding. The committee will continue to offer bipartisan solutions to strengthen and modernize our nation's infrastructure and transportation programs. We will aim to alleviate the ongoing inflation, energy, and supply chain problems. I do appreciate Ranking Member Larson for working with us on the views and estimates, and I urge my colleagues to support the views and estimates for fiscal year 2024. I now recognize Mr. Larson for your statement.
Mr. Chair, thank you for recognizing me, and thank you for working with the Democrats on the budget views and estimates. We know that while the report reflects a bipartisan effort, not all members of the committee will agree with every aspect of the report, but this report does in fact serve as a great starting point for our efforts in the 118th Congress. We also know that there's a lot of work ahead of us, the hard work of reauthorizing the Federal Aviation Administration, the Coast Guard, pipeline safety programs, drafting the Water Resources Development Act, and implementing the bipartisan infrastructure law, just to name a few. We have a lot of work ahead of us to keep the economy moving and to build a safer and more accessible transportation system. These views and estimates, I believe, reflect our desire to work together in a bipartisan and productive manner. So I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting the FY 2024 budget views and estimates, and thank you, and yield back.
Do any other members wish to be recognized for a statement on the views and estimates for fiscal year 2024? Seeing none, are there any amendments to the views and estimates for fiscal year 2024? Hearing none, the question is now on the adoption and favorable reporting of the views and estimates for fiscal year 2024. All those in favor signify by saying aye. All those opposed signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it, and the views and estimates for fiscal year 2024 are adopted. Pursuant to Rule 10, Clause 4, I ask unanimous consent that the fiscal year 2024 views and estimates be adopted by the Committee on Transportation that were adopted by the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure be submitted to the Committee on Budget, and without objection, that is so ordered. Our next item for consideration is House Resolution 152. I'd ask unanimous consent to discharge the Subcommittee on Highways and Transit from further consideration of House Resolution 152, and without objection, that is so ordered. I now call up the resolution for consideration, and without objection, the reading of the resolution is dispensed with. The resolution is now considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I recognize myself for 5 minutes for a statement on the resolution. House Resolution 152 supports move-over laws that all 50 states have enacted and promotes awareness of those laws. Move-over laws protect traffic incident management responders such as law enforcement, fire and rescue officials, emergency medical personnel, tow truck operators, transportation workers, everyone. House Resolution 152 will help increase public awareness of move-over laws and help protect our traffic incident management responders. I now recognize Mr. Larson for 5 minutes on a statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I support this resolution that calls attention to the value of the need of move-over laws. These common sense laws seek to protect the women and men working as traffic incident management responders along our highways by requiring drivers to move at least one lane over when there's a crash or roadside emergency. Tragically, in 2022, 50 traffic incident management responders were killed in roadside collisions. These deaths are preventable. Not enough drivers understand the value and importance of slowing down and moving over to ensure safety. And a recent GAO report found that raising awareness is one of the most prevalent challenges to state officials in trying to implement move-over laws. So I urge my colleagues to support this resolution. I want to thank Representative McGovern of Massachusetts for sponsoring it. With that, I yield back.
I now recognize the Highway and Transit Subcommittee Chair, Mr. Crawford, for his statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm speaking today in support of HRS 152, which was introduced by Mr. McGovern of Massachusetts. It's actually the third time that we'll have attempted to pass this bill. I have no doubt that we'll pass it. The problem has been with the Senate's willingness to take this bill up. It makes sense to me that we should pass this and that the Senate should follow suit. First responders, including police, fire, medical, and towing workers, risk being injured or killed by passing vehicles when they respond to a roadside emergency. To increase roadway safety and protect first responders, each state, including the District of Columbia, has enacted move-over laws. While move-over laws vary from state to state, they generally require motorists to move over one lane or slow down when passing these workers who are so critical to our community safety. Despite each state's enactment of a law, in December 2020, the Government Accountability Office, or GAO, found that public education was a primary challenge to the success of move-over laws, as motorists may not know the law exists in their state or their specific requirements. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or IJA, requires GAO to update this work and perform a review of each state's move-over law and provide Congress with recommendations to improve public awareness campaigns, research, or education efforts to ensure first responders and transportation workers are safe as they perform their jobs. I look forward to receiving these recommendations. In the meantime, I urge support of this resolution and yield back the balance of my time.
Do any other members wish to be recognized for a statement on the resolution? Seeing none, are there any amendments to House Resolution 152? Hearing none, the question is now on the adoption and favorable reporting of House Resolution 152. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All opposed signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it, and the resolution is adopted and ordered favorably reported to the House. Without objection, the motion to consider is laid on the table. Our next item for consideration is House Concurrent Resolution 15. I'd ask unanimous consent to discharge the Subcommittee on Economic Development, Public Buildings, and Emergency Management from further consideration of House Concurrent Resolution 15. Without objection, that is so ordered. I call up the resolution for consideration, and without objection, the first reading of the resolution is dispensed with. The resolution is now considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I recognize myself for 5 minutes for a statement. I wish to thank Subcommittee Chairman Perry and Ranking Member Titus for their leadership on this resolution. House Concurrent Resolution 15 honors our nation's fallen law enforcement officers who died in the line of duty last year with a memorial service here at the Capitol. And every day, obviously, our police officers show up to protect and serve, keeping families, businesses, and our communities safe. Unfortunately, too many of our police officers are demonized and disparaged for doing one of the hardest and probably one of the most important jobs in the country, and it's a job that continues to grow more dangerous all the time. Over the last decade, violent crime in U.S. cities has risen 12%. In May, the memorial service will honor 450 fallen officers who sacrificed their lives to protect their communities, including 7 brave men and women from Missouri. We owe our gratitude to those police officers who continue to serve despite the very challenging times. This memorial service is one small way to thank and honor the men and women who made the ultimate sacrifice. I urge support of this resolution and now recognize Ranking Member Larson for his statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I join you in supporting the passage of H-Con Res 15, which was introduced by Representative Scott Perry of Pennsylvania and Representative Dina Titus of Nevada, the chair and ranking, respectively, of the Subcommittee on Economic Development, Public Buildings, and Emergency Management. This resolution authorizes the use of the Capitol grounds for the 42nd Annual National Peace Officers Memorial Service on May 15, 2023. The event, which the National Fraternal Order of Police hosts, will honor the federal, state, and local law enforcement officers who lost their lives while performing their duties in 2022. One of those officers was Everett Police Officer Dan Rocha, who was killed in the line of duty while responding to a call near Everett Community College on Friday, March 25th, 2022. Officer Rocha made an incredible impact on his community, my hometown, serving as an officer with the Everett Police Department. Law enforcement officers like Officer Rocha have dedicated their careers in keeping communities and residents safe, deserve this honor at the annual National Peace Officers Memorial Service. In addition, families and friends of the deceased, event organizers expect 25,000 police officers from around the country to attend as well. Mr. Chair, I support this bipartisan resolution and call on colleagues to support it. With that, I yield back.
I now recognize the resolution sponsor, Economic Development, Public Buildings, and Emergency Management Subcommittee Chairman, Mr. Perry, for 5 minutes.
I thank you, Chairman Graves, Ranking Member Larson. I'm proud to have introduced this resolution along with the subcommittee ranking member, Ms. Titus, and I thank her for her efforts as well. This resolution authorizes the use of the Capitol grounds for the 42nd Annual National Peace Officers Memorial Event to honor law enforcement officers who have made the ultimate sacrifice. These men and women put on their uniforms every day to serve and protect our communities and our families, and they don't know what's on the other side of the door when they walk out of it. Violent crime continues to be a daily tragedy in our country. It is critical for us to recognize that police officers are doing an extremely difficult and dangerous job day in, day out, hour by hour, 24/7, 365, just to keep our citizens safe. To all the law enforcement officers who put on the badge each day and who wear it with honor, we say thank you, and we support you. This resolution is just one small way we can demonstrate our support for these officers and their families and honor the men and women who lost their lives in the line of duty in 2022. I urge my colleagues to support this resolution, and I yield the balance.
I now recognize the resolution's minority sponsor, the subcommittee ranking member, Ms. Titus, for her statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. House Concurrent Resolution 15, as you have heard, authorizes the use of the Capitol grounds for the 42nd Annual National Peace Officers Memorial Service and for the National Honor Guard and Pipe Band exhibition. As the ranking member of the Subcommittee of Economic Development, Public Buildings, and Emergency Management, it's my honor to carry this resolution again this session, now alongside the Subcommittee Chairman, Mr. Perry. Thank you for working together with us on this. The memorial service, which will be held on May 15th, will be coordinated with the architect of the Capitol and Capitol Police. It will honor 557 officers whose names will be added to the memorial, including 9 from my state of Nevada. The memorial will continue to recognize the sacrifice of law enforcement in the line of duty. This includes during the pandemic, as they served among the millions of frontline and essential workers who day in and day out continued to risk their lives and their families' lives to keep us all safe as we slowed the spread of this deadly virus. We can't bring back those we've lost, but we can certainly honor the sacrifice they made to keep all of us, our loved ones, and our communities safe. I'd like to note the 8 officers from Southern Nevada who made the ultimate sacrifice. Bailiff Gerald Bear Smith, Las Vegas Metro Police Officer Philip Cozy, Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department Sergeant Douglas King, Senior Federal Air Marshal Sean Hennessy, Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department Officer Edward Contreras, Special U.S. Deputy Marshal Jose Gomez, Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department Detective Justin Terry, and Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department Officer Trong Tai. My condolences are with the families and the loved ones of these public servants and all of those mourning the loss of the 557 brave men and women whose duty and sacrifice will be commemorated at this year's memorial service. I urge the committee to join me in supporting this tribute to our fallen officers, and I yield back.
Do any other members wish to be recognized for a statement on the resolution? Seeing none, are there any amendments to House Concurrent Resolution 15? Hearing none, the question is now on the adoption of favorable reporting of House Concurrent Resolution 15. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the resolution is agreed to and ordered favorably reported to the House. Without objection, The motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Okay, our next item for consideration is H.R. 783, the bill to designate the Department of Energy Integrated Engineering Research Center federal building located at the Fermi National Accelerator Laboratory in Batavia, Illinois, as the Helen Edwards Engineering Research Center. It's a lot of talk. I ask unanimous consent to discharge the Subcommittee on Economic Development, Public Buildings, and Emergency Management from further consideration of H.R. 783, and without objection, that is so ordered. I now call up the bill for consideration without objection. The first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill is now considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I recognize myself for 5 minutes for a statement. So this bill recognizes the work of Dr. Helen Edwards, a leading physicist in the field of accelerator science, by naming the Fermi National Accelerator Laboratory in her honor. Helen Edwards is best known for her work that positioned the United States as a global leader in accelerator science. The bill is a fitting honor to recognize the late Dr. Edwards' important research and discoveries. And I urge my colleagues to support the bill. I now recognize Mr. Larson for 5 minutes. Statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to join you in supporting the passage of H.R. 783, a bill introduced by Illinois Representatives Bill Foster and Lauren Underwood, which designates the Department of Energy's Integrated Engineering Research Center federal building in Batavia, Illinois, as the Helen Edwards Engineering Research Center. Dr. Edwards was a celebrated and distinguished particle accelerator physicist best known for the design, construction, commissioning, and operation of the Tevatron, which for 25 years was the most powerful particle collider in the world. Dr. Edwards worked at the Fermi Lab from 1970 until 1992. The work on the Tevatron earned Dr. Edwards the MacArthur Fellowship Genius Grant and the National Medal of Technology. She also received the Department of Energy's E.O. Lawrence Award and the Robert R. Wilson Prize of the American Physical Society. Dr. Edwards passed away on June 21st, 2016 at the age of 80. So I ask my colleagues to support the passage of H.R. 783. And thank you, Mr. Chair, and with that, I yield back.
I now recognize Economic Development, Public Buildings, and Emergency Management Subcommittee Chair, Mr. Perry, for his statement.
Thank you, Mr. Graves, Chairman. This bill would name the Fermi National Accelerator Laboratory federal building after Helen Edwards, a physicist known for her work in accelerator science. Dr. Edwards oversaw the construction and implementation of the Tevatron, which helped scientists discover the existence of elementary particles, advancing our knowledge of particle physics. Helen Edwards' former colleagues have said, quote, "She didn't put up with the bureaucracy when she wanted something done and knew it could be done," end quote, and that she was constantly frustrated by red tape. Her important discoveries show what's possible when you can cut through the bureaucracy and do what needs to be done. I urge my colleagues to support the bill and yield back the balance of the time.
I now recognize Subcommittee Ranking Member Ms. Titus for her statement. No statement. Do any of the members wish to be recognized for a statement on the resolution? Seeing none, are there any amendments to H.R. 783? Hearing none, the question is now on the adoption and favorable reporting of H.R. 783. All those in favor signify by saying aye. All opposed signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it, and H.R. 783 is agreed to and ordered favorably reported to the House. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. All right. Our next item for consideration are 10 General Service Administration, or GSA, Capital Investment and Leasing Program resolutions. I'd ask unanimous consent to call up the resolutions en bloc and that they be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Without objection, that is so ordered, and I recognize myself for 5 minutes on the GSA resolutions en bloc. So today we have 10 resolutions, GSA resolutions, including 2 resolutions providing for alterations to courthouses in Alabama and Mississippi, which make repairs to the physical security in the building systems. And we also have changes to or deteriorating building envelopes that we're dealing with in these as well. The 8 additional leases included are going to save taxpayers over $382 million in lease cost avoidance. I urge my colleagues to approve these resolutions in block, and I now recognize Mr. Larson for his statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I support the 10 General Services Administration resolutions before us today. 2 of those resolutions authorize GSA to repair, alter, and modernize multiple interior building systems and failing exteriors at the U.S. Federal Building and Courthouse in Selma, Alabama, and the William Culmer Federal Building and U.S. Courthouse in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. Further, there are 8 resolutions authorize GSA to lease space, which those are listed in the record, so I won't read through them. I will note that there's an EPA lease and a Centers for Disease Control lease in Seattle, and we'll follow up with those folks to let them know we're doing this work. Interestingly, 5 of these resolutions authorize GSA to lease space for 20 years, but at smaller footprints. And 2 of the resolutions maintain the current agency footprints, but only for 3 to 5 years to allow the agencies to develop new space plans and to budget for future relocation costs. And 1 resolution is both a space reduction and a short-term extension. So, Mr. Chair, I support these responsible activities. I urge my colleagues to do the same. With that, I yield back.
And that will recognize Economic Development, Public Buildings, Emergency Management Subcommittee Chair, Mr. Perry, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Graves. I support today's package of GSA resolutions, which include 2 courthouse alteration projects and 8 leases. The leases represent a nearly 400,000 square foot reduction in space, saving taxpayers over $382 million in avoided lease costs over the terms of those particular leases. Additionally, both courthouse projects make critical repairs to deteriorating buildings and outdated security systems. I want to note that my intention is to closely review every prospectus submitted to the committee from the General Services Administration to ensure that they absolutely make sense. Over the next 5 years, more than half of GSA's leases are expiring, giving us an opportunity to let go of unneeded space while ensuring federal employees can return to in-person workspaces. GSA and its tenant agencies must reassess their space needs and get rid of what they aren't using. This has been a problem well before COVID hit, and the ongoing teleworking policies of the current administration have only made it worse. You'll notice that every lease resolution we are considering today has significant space reductions or is a short-term lease needed to consolidate agencies into more efficient lease space. It's simple. If space is not being used, taxpayers should not be paying for it. I urge my colleagues to support the GSA resolutions en bloc, and I yield the balance.
Sounds controversial.
Do any other members wish to be recognized? Mr. Ezell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word. I want to thank the committee for including a resolution in today's markup that will support the Culmer Federal Building in Mississippi's 4th District. Previous GSA studies have supported the need for the project, which focuses on solving current security issues, such as adding a secured judge's elevator and creating new prisoner circulating pathways. Also, the project will support building improvements, including work to ensure that fire alarms and sprinkler systems are up to code. Ultimately, these renovations will avoid the need to build a new courthouse. Thank you again to this committee for working on issues that affect my district directly. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Do any other members wish to be recognized? Seeing none, are there any amendments to the GSA resolutions in block? Hearing none, the question is now on adoption of GSA resolution in block. The GSA resolutions in block. All those in favor signify by saying aye. All opposed signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and GSA resolutions in block are agreed to and approved. The next item for consideration is House Joint Resolution 27, and I'd ask unanimous consent to discharge the Subcommittee on Water Resources and Environment for further consideration on HJ Res 27. Without objection, that is so ordered. I now call up the resolution for consideration. Without objection, the first reading of the resolution is dispensed with. The resolution is now considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I recognize myself for 5 minutes for a statement on the resolution. House Joint Resolution 27, it utilizes the Congressional Review Act to provide congressional disapproval of the administration's flawed new WOTUS rule, meaning that if adopted, the rule would not take effect. I am the sponsor of this legislation, along with House Resources and Environmental Subcommittee Chair Rouser and over 150 of my colleagues here in the House. The Clean Water Act was landmark legislation. It was signed into law 50 years ago and has greatly improved the health of our nation's waters. Unfortunately, we have repeatedly seen improper interpretations of the Clean Water Act result in the implementation of flawed and overreaching water regulations. This has hindered our ability to achieve the law's underlying goals. There is no clearer example of this than the debate over the definition of a waters of the United States and the controversy over how to regulate these waters. The 2020 Navigable Waters Protection Rule provided much-needed clarity on the scope of what exactly constitutes a WOTUS. However, the Biden administration repealed the NWPR and replaced it with their own WOTUS definition, which is scheduled to take effect in just a few weeks. As we heard in our hearing earlier this month, the new definition directly conflicts with the congressional intent and places costly and unclear burdens on farmers, on small businesses, builders, and just everyday Americans. I'm reminded how massive and abusive this level of overreach is when farmer after farmer in my district talk to me about the litigation that they've become mired in over the years, over the WOTUS definition, and their frustrations with simply trying to put in a pond or improve their own land. So I urge my colleagues to support House Joint Resolution 27. I look forward to overturning this flawed, burdensome, and overreaching WOTUS rule. I now recognize Ranking Member Larson for 5 minutes, his statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Last Congress, the House and Senate reached a historic bipartisan agreement on a once-in-a-generation investment in our nation's infrastructure through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. The BIL addressed the very real and critical challenges facing all of our communities, no matter where they are, with an investment of almost $13 billion in clean water infrastructure upgrades. In fact, just last week, EPA announced that $2.2 billion in additional BIL funding is now available to states, tribes, and territories through the Clean Water State Revolving Fund to help communities upgrade essential wastewater and stormwater infrastructure, including $36.6 million from my home state of Washington. Nearly half of the funding is provided as grants or loan forgiveness to help underserved communities across the country invest in critical water infrastructure and create jobs. The BIL showed that Congress is capable of working when it is focused on addressing the needs to ensure access to clean water for every American family. Unfortunately, our first committee markup of the 118th Congress will not carry on that effort. For years, some in Congress have pushed to weaken the robust federal-state partnership envisioned by the Clean Water Act to protect water quality. In fact, this resolution is the 6th time in the last decade that the Congress has tried to legislate on the Clean Water Act, the last time being a Congressional Review Act vote in the 114th Congress. Congressional efforts such as this, as well as the previous administration's rulemaking and the revisionist tendencies of conservative judges on the Supreme Court, all share a common goal: to weaken the federal protections of our nation's waters and benefit those who are polluting rivers, streams, and wetlands. Now, my state is defined by its clean water, including the health of the Puget Sound, the hundreds of lakes, and thousands of miles of rivers and streams throughout Washington state. Washingtonians know that rivers, streams, and wetlands are intrinsically connected. The health of Washington's waters and its water-related economy depend on strong state, federal, local partnership and a level playing field among its upstream and downstream neighbors, including those on tribal lands. And it was this need for a level playing field and our overarching and bipartisan commitment to protect clean water that compelled this committee to pass the original Clean Water Act over 50 years ago. Yet, it seems our shared commitment to clean water has been replaced by efforts such as this resolution of disapproval to weaken that protection. And not only that, it will also create unnecessary confusion and uncertainty. If you think the enactment of this resolution will provide clarity, let me be clear about my position: I don't believe that it will. Nor will the resolution bring back the 2020 rule adopted by the previous administration, because that effort was rightly rejected last year by a federal district court and resulting in a reinstatement of the decades-old Reagan-era regulations as those were interpreted by the Bush administration. Enactment of this resolution will also not remove the Supreme Court's significant nexus test, because that test, along with the relatively permanent test, was mandated by the court in the Rapanos decision, and it is the core of both this administration's rule that would be invalidated and the Reagan-Bush rule, which would replace it should this resolution become law. Finally, for those hoping that conservative justices on the Supreme Court, or actually any of the justices on the Supreme Court, will somehow fix this issue for us, enactment of the CRA will likely frustrate that outcome as well. Why? because the resolution undermines the ability of the Corps and the EPA to respond to any changes that might result from the court's decision in the Sackett decision later this year. And that's because the underlying Congressional Review Act rule would prevent a similar rule from being adopted. That's why this resolution makes no sense. It would invalidate the current WOTUS rule, the one that this administration proposed last year, with its additional clarifications, sideboards, and regulatory exclusions requested by stakeholders, but replace it with a substantially similar, although less clear, regulatory framework. It creates more ambiguity and confusion over protecting the rivers and streams and other water bodies that provide drinking water to over 117 million Americans at a time when many of these states are facing historic droughts. It ties the hands of federal agencies seeking to help individuals comply with the law, meaning the Corps and EPA could not adjust or refine the WOTUS rule, nor could they respond to any potential changed Supreme Court tests, whichever way the court rules, unless Congress acts again. In my view, this bill will lessen, not increase, not increase certainty, and frankly, it's a big mistake. So I continue to support this administration's efforts to make sure critical water-related investments, including the BIL, are quickly and efficiently implemented, and this administration's efforts I support to protect water quality and provide stakeholders with additional clarity to comply with the Clean Water Act. So I ask members to oppose this resolution because it accomplishes none of those goals. With that, I yield back.
I now recognize Water Resources Subcommittee Chair, Mr. Rouser. For his statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'm proud to support this resolution, and I'm equally proud to have introduced this legislation alongside you and more than 150 of our colleagues here in the House. And in fact, I would argue that this may be the most important vote, one of the biggest votes, most important votes that we cast this Congress. The unfortunate reality is this resolution is necessary because of the Biden administration's misguided decision to publish a new definition of the waters of the United States, or WOTUS as we call it, under the Clean Water Act that places unnecessary burdens on property owners, communities, farmers, businesses, builders, municipalities, and industries who rely on clean water, and just as importantly, clarity of the law. Therefore, it's incredibly important that Congress ensures this misguided, ambiguous, and overreaching WOTUS definition has no force. Without question, we should be proud that the Clean Water Act has functioned to improve the quality of our nation's rivers, lakes, and streams for more than 50 years. However, important legislation like the Clean Water Act, while certainly beneficial in its purpose, can lead to bureaucratic overreach and regulatory headaches that often don't make sense to the regulated communities. We certainly heard this problem from stakeholders at our hearing a couple weeks back. Regulations of any type, and I firmly believe this, should be simple and easy to follow. They should carry out the intent of the law in a clear and transparent manner, enabling consistent enforcement by their mere simplicity and clarity. There should be no subjectivity or wiggle room for any bureaucrat or bureaucrats to substitute their own biases. And that's not the case here, unfortunately. I've said it before and will continue to say it. There's no greater example of bureaucratic overreach under the Clean Water Act than with the regulatory ordeal of understanding and complying with the definition of a WOTUS. For example, in areas like my home state of North Carolina, my district, frequent storms cause water to linger in areas that shouldn't be classified as wetlands. The inconsistency of the law's interpretation and fluctuating weather promises indefinite headaches and legal wrangling for North Carolinians and Americans all across the country. The definition of WOTUS is crucial for determining a number of applications under the law, such as state and tribal water quality certification programs and pollutant discharge permits. Importantly, this definition is also used to determine who must obtain a Clean Water Act Section 404 permit for dredging and filled material. The 404 process is notorious for being costly and time-consuming, and at times used as a roadblock to stop projects that some just simply don't like, regardless of the merits. If a homeowner, road builder, or farmer, to name a few, takes action modifying a water, and later the area in question is determined to be a WOTUS, they can face staggering fines of tens of thousands of dollars per day or even jail time. Farmers are often targets of trial lawyers seeking to sacrifice the efficiency and sustainability of our food system to further exploit our judicial system for financial gain. We've certainly seen that in North Carolina. Broad legal and ambiguous definitions, such as the term significant nexus, empowers them to seek these kinds of suits. At our hearing the other week, we heard how years of regulatory headaches and fees can halt progress on affordable housing projects and on important infrastructure development at a time of incredible promise for these industries. It hasn't always been like this, and it doesn't have to be this way. I was heartened back in 2020 when the Trump administration released the Navigable Waters Protection Rule, which finally brought clarity and predictability to the nagging question of what a WOTUS should be, and it balanced state jurisdiction with federal responsibilities. As such, I was disappointed when the Biden administration released its final version of this new WOTUS definition, notably, I note, Friday before New Year's Eve in the thick and hustle and bustle of the holidays. Imagine that. In addition to the content of the Biden administration's WOTUS rule itself, I'm particularly disappointed they have forced it on the public at this time. In October of this past year, the Supreme Court heard a case on the definition of WOTUS, which has the possibility of clarifying what WOTUS is, and therefore could render much of this WOTUS rule inapplicable. Common sense not only suggests, but it demands this administration pause and wait to see what the Supreme Court decides before jamming this rule through now. We should not have to take this step of passing this CRA, as the Biden administration did not have to take this action. However, this is a situation we find ourselves in, and the reason why Congress should pass this resolution immediately. I urge my colleagues to support this resolution, and before I yield back, Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a letter from stakeholders across the industries from February 27, 2023.
Without objection,
I yield back.
ordered. I now recognize Ranking Member Napolitano for her statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise with very strong opposition to this resolution of disapproval. Clean water were not always a partisan issue, and no issue has more support among American families than the protection of our nation's waters. Now is the worst time to lower our guard on protecting clean water, as over half of the United States are experiencing drought conditions. We need to be doing everything to ensure our cities, our businesses, our farmers have sufficient, safe, and sustainable water supplies of water to meet our economic and agricultural needs, our quality of life needs, and our day-to-day survival. I've dedicated much of my time in Congress to protecting our critical water supplies and making sure that we capture, use, and reuse every available drop of water in our communities, and I don't plan to stop now. Last week, public survey found that Westerners are more concerned than ever about inadequate water supplies. Almost 9 in 10 Westerners say that inadequate water supply is a serious problem in their state. This is especially true in my home state of California, as the Metropolitan Water District, the biggest district in our area, commented to my subcommittees earlier this month. The definition of WOTUS is central to the Clean Water Act's implementation and has significant implications for Metropolitan's day-to-day operations and source water protection efforts. That is why I support the efforts of the Biden administration to permanently repeal the previous administration's Dirty Water Rule, a rule that eliminated federal protections on a minimum of 75% of the stream and wetlands that have been protected by the Act since its inception. These waters and wetlands are critical to capturing and storing rain and snowmelt to ensure long-term water supply and recharge our underground aquifers. Yet the Dirty Water Rule limited or eliminated protections over waters that provide a source of drinking water to over 117 million Americans. Mr. Chairman, I cannot understand how this resolution, which seeks to undermine and confuse agency efforts to protect clean water, makes any sense to my constituents who are already making sacrifices to protect our local water. Yes, there is a cost to protecting our communities, our sources of drinking water, and our environment. However, that cost should be borne by those seeking to pollute our waterways or fill our wetlands for their own personal gain, rather than transferring that cost to the average American or to downstream states. This resolution would increase level of pollution in our water bodies and increase risk of downstream flooding, and increase certain communities like mine cannot maintain sustainable sources of drinking water. Worst of all, hardworking American families have to pay for the horrible impacts of this resolution. We all want certainty, and for decades, that regulation established by former President Reagan and implemented by every Republican and Democratic administration since then established a framework to achieve that certainty. but we believe we can have certainty as well as clean water. We don't have to choose between them. To me, the answer is clear. The Biden rule provides the best available option to balance the need for protecting our waters with the desire for familiarity and workability within the constraints of the law and interpretations of the Supreme Court. This resolution achieves none of those outcomes and only likely to make it worse, not better. I strongly oppose this resolution and urge my colleagues to vote against it and yield back the balance of my time.
Any other members wish to be heard? Mr. Duarte?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to speak in strong support of this resolution, and I want to share some of my experiences as a farmer who's been prosecuted under the Clean Water Act concerning wetlands considered to have a significant nexus. This prosecution, should be noted, was done with threat of criminal penalties to me and my family all along the way. The prosecution, and this clean water rule threatens our nation's food supply. I want to make a very clear point. The farm that we farmed and got prosecuted on had been a wheat farm in the 70s, 80s, all the way back to the 1950s, with clear documented history that this had been a wheat farm. It was idled and moved to grazing through the 90s and 2000s because the wheat price was very low. In 2010, our property in Tehama County, California, by us, was farmed to wheat again, 2011. We farmed wheat on this property with the same practices, tillage depth, that it had been farmed to wheat many, many times before. The Army Corps of Engineers field agent accused us of deep ripping it, which was later proven false by their own field expert team. The EPA wouldn't take up the prosecution because it wasn't consistent with what they were telling Congress at the time when the Obama WOTUS rule was going through. So the Army Corps of Engineers then took it to the Department of Justice to prosecute us. So the Department of Justice, Environment and Water prosecuted a farmer in California, this farmer, for tilling wheat land that had been tilled many times before. Now, this was during a global food crisis. This is when the Arab Spring popped up, when American families were seeing food inflation much similar to how they are seeing it now. As climate change comes on, many of these idled acres that have farmed wheat and other crops in times when the market demand was high and the supply was short will need to be redeployed to produce food for American families in the world in the future. This WOTUS rule that expands the definition of what is a wetland under Clean Water Act jurisdiction to pockets of vernal pools in the middle of fields, in my case, as small as 16 square feet. Please picture the Thanksgiving card table that your children or you as a child may have sat at. That is the jurisdictional reach of what is being claimed under both the Obama and under this current Biden WOTUS rule. This rule will regulate food production in an overbearing way, will open for the prosecution of family farmers nationwide. It will allow for third-party lawsuits and harassment of our food producers nationwide. It will exacerbate inflation for American families nationwide and threaten food supply globally. As we run into climate and geopolitical strains on our food system today, please realize that this rule will limit the ability of American farmers to switch cropping systems and respond to markets as they currently can. This rule is a threat to farm families. This rule is a threat to the nation's food supply. This rule will exacerbate inflation, and this rule will effectively remove millions of acres of viable farmland from our food production system that could otherwise be deployed in the future. So thank you very much. I stand strongly with this rule as a farmer who has been prosecuted under the Clean Water Act jurisdictions, in my opinion, fairly onerously. Thank you.
Anyone else wish to be heard? Mr. Stanton?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. As a member who represents the Desert Southwest, I can tell you that no issue is top of mind more than water. Arizona is ground zero for the impact of climate change. We are in the midst of our region's worst drought in 1,200 years. Safeguarding our water and making sure we have enough clean water is essential to our economy and to our way of life. And in Arizona, 3.2 million people receive their drinking water from systems that rely, at least in part, on intermittent, ephemeral, or headwater streams. The issue before us matters a great deal. What we need in Arizona is certainty, and this resolution provides less certainty, not more. I know there are some who want to go back to the Trump-era rule, which provided absolutely no protections for ephemeral streams. I believe that that is wrong for Arizona and wrong for regions such as the Southwest, where every drop of clean water counts. But if that's the intent of the resolution today, it cannot achieve that purpose. The Trump-era rule is gone. What this resolution does is create a cloudy sea of uncertainty for my state and would tie the hands of the agency from providing the necessary clarity that many have called for. And it would destroy the certainty of regulatory excluded waters that are included in the current rule. Because this resolution creates more uncertainty and hurts Arizona, I will vote no. I yield back.
Mr. LaMalfa.
Clarity. For anybody farming, there is no clarity other than absolute taking of water rights, the ability to farm your land. I represented and represent what Mr. Doherty's talking about. He and at least 2 other growers in Tehama County in Northern California that have had some combination of EPA, Army Corps, or DOJ coming down upon them for doing practices that have been considered normal, at least since the beginning of the Clean Water Act and other regulatory measures. And then they changed arbitrarily. And these guys find themselves defending their financial, agricultural lives from bureaucrats that don't care how long they take to decide. If you do decide you want to play the game of changing your ag land use from a wheat field to an orchard, or from this type of orchard, a different type of orchard where you normally pull the trees out and deep rip, et cetera, and put a new set of trees in, you have a new arbitrary ideal thought up 30, 40 years after the Clean Water Act of saying, oh, this is going to change the watershed. This is going to change the landscape because you pulled up a furrow. You have people actually looking at the idea that there's a furrow, that now that is in itself a watershed, like a mountain. And they get away with this because these landowners can't hang on and be in court year after year after year. And so they settle. They give up $1 million, $2 million, or they may give up a piece of land because you have people in government that want clarity to mean absolute control over all water supply. Every drop it hits the ground, they believe the federal government should be in charge of. This is nonsense. Mr. Duarte was absolutely right. This endangers the ability to grow food consistently and know what the hell the rules are from year in, year out. You don't know what the rules are because a bureaucrat can come out there and stand in your field like I stood back in the days in the state legislature when they were doing this to one of my growers. Looking at a patch, they had these little samples of different vegetation on there. They had on some patch they took out on a board they took out of a lab they had somewhere, and we're trying to compare the color of this patch of weeds here to one they had on their piece of cardboard that was stored in a laboratory somewhere. Say, oh, is this, is that? That is ridiculous. Some 25-year-old standing out here in somebody's field trying to decide, can this person change the level of their land in order to make their water work a little better, a little more efficiently, in order to grow crops so people can eat and not have to import it. Yeah, we need this measure to put things back in check. The clarity needs to be for the customers, the people, not the convenience of the freaking government to say, oh, we can be in control of everything. I can't believe this place sometimes. I can't believe what government puts people through that are just trying to produce something good, to sustain the public's food supply, to provide employment for those that live in rural areas. Indeed, this is another attack on rural America, as we see it all the time, coming out of Sacramento and out of Washington, D.C. We need this measure just to put things back in a little bit of order and then work with the farmers and the ranchers and the people that produce and the timber operators and the miners that say, you know what, we're not trying to do bad things here. We're trying to actually produce things that people thought they need. Something besides video games and crypto and whatever everybody seems all worried about these days. These are the bottom line issues that people really need. And as times get tougher, it's going to become more apparent. Mr. Duarte, I have a little bit of time left. If you'd like me to yield it to you, if you want something else you'd like to take away there. But, you know, clarity really needs to be provided on behalf of the people that produce and those that try and produce it. John?
Well, Congressman LaMalfa, just a big thank you. You were there. You were there when we had our battles, as silly as they seemed. You're there today. Thank you for your comments.
Mr. Van Orden?
The unintended negative environmental and economic consequences of these rules really cannot be properly measured. The ambiguity that it injects into the system leads our farmers and builders and railroadmen and all the rest of the folks that this affects, leaves them in the dark, and they don't know how to proceed. And that's unacceptable. 85% of my district, the 3rd Congressional District of the state of Wisconsin, would be subject to oversight by the federal government. And speaking to my farmers, they are to a man and a woman opposed to this rule, and I will be voting for this resolution in solidarity with our farmers because they are the backbone not only of my district, but of this nation. I yield back.
Mr. Yakim? Do any of the members wish to be? Mr. Molinar.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, Mr. Duarte is a living example of what is a clear regulatory overreach. I came in listening to this comment about ensuring clarity. I live in perhaps the most overregulated state in America, second perhaps only to California. At times, New York might outrank my friends in that category. We have a standard environmental review policy. We have established local review and consideration of water quality and the impacts of development and farming on tributaries. My gosh, the state of New York is the birthplace of an environmental review. This is a taking by the EPA. This regulation is clearly an overreach, saying to farmers, in particular in upstate New York, where there are small family farms, that a good amount of your property, which you have been engaged in farming for generations, is suddenly no longer yours. In a part of the state where we feel continued outward pressure for housing development, large tracts of land no longer can be subdivided, or housing can no longer be built there because the EPA steps in and basically overrides and overrules even the state of New York's regulatory authority. That is added pressure, diminishing both production in family farms, significant impacts, adding significant cost, but it also adds significant development pressure, driving up the property value and the cost of development in suburbs around major metropolitan centers and like the rural communities I represent. This is a taking. There's a proper process for a regulation of this nature to be imposed on the American people, and it's not a bureaucrat on a whim establishing what is or is not developable or usable lands, what is or is not navigable or not navigable waters. It's just, for the countless amounts of infrastructure projects we try to move, for the development projects where we want housing to drive down housing costs for farmers, this just upends all of that. And I'd offer in a state like New York, where aging infrastructure and the need to move highway construction, road and bridge repair, this just adds more and more burden, more and more complexities, and an incentive not to move forward with development. By the way, taking away good quality jobs, most of which in New York are trades and local labor, not being able to move forward with construction, and upending the ability of local communities to plan for the future. I support the resolution because, at the very least, the clarity we hope to offer is there is a process for regulations like this, and it isn't the way in which the EPA or this administration has moved forward. And I'm new here, so I do take offense every time somebody likes to assign a name of some enemy, some villain, to any piece of legislation just to make it seem like it's a bad thing. It's a bad policy no matter which president did or didn't do it. This is bad policy. And quite frankly, as I've said, just upends both this country's respect for property rights and the process we put in place for regulation to be legislated, not imposed by bureaucrats. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Do any other members wish to be heard?
Mr. Huffman.
Mr. Huffman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, if it's certainty and clarity that we want to see, this is the wrong way to get there, because the Congressional Review Act is a blunt instrument. It freezes the field, not just for this administration, but for future administrations, to do any regulation that is substantially similar on this subject. When we had our last hearing on this matter, we heard time and again from our Republican friends, no WOTUS before SCOTUS. Let's hear what the Supreme Court has to say on this subject, and yet here we are, plowing ahead with this blunt instrument that would freeze the regulatory field, even for future administrations. Now, if the Supreme Court issues a new standard, in this case that it's taken review of, as it did in the Rapanos case, we're stuck with that. Future administrations would be unable to issue implementing regulations. Future administrations would be unable to clarify ambiguities. They'd be unable to fix errors that this Supreme Court might make in its infinite wisdom. Why the heck would that make any sense? Well, it would only make sense, I believe, if you're pretty sure that this Supreme Court is going to gut the Clean Water Act, is going to take massive amounts of the waterways of the United States off the table for Clean Water Act protection, and you want to freeze in place the ability for anyone to do anything about it. That, I guess, is a type of certainty. It's a type of clarity, but it ought to give great pause to anyone that cares about clean water, anyone that remembers how we got here 50 years ago when we passed the Clean Water Act on a bipartisan basis because we had rivers that caught fire. We had Great Lakes that were deemed off limits for fishing and aquatic life. This wrong-headed CRA would take us back potentially 50 years. It is a bad idea at a bad time, and I urge my colleagues to vote no.
Any other members wish to be heard? Seeing none, are there any amendments to House Joint Resolution 27? Hearing none, the question is now on the adoption and favorable reporting of House Joint Resolution 27. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying nay.
Nay.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The resolution.
Mr. Chair.
So the gentleman
Roll call
requests a recorded vote as previously announced
Recorded vote, yes.
pursuant to Committee Rule 6F for the proceedings on the question are postponed. So we'll roll that to the end. All right, next. Our next item for consideration is House Resolution 1152, the Water Quality Certification and Energy Project Improvement Act of 2023. And I'd ask unanimous consent to discharge the Subcommittee on Water Resources and Environment from further consideration of H.R. 1152. Without objection, that is so ordered. I call up the bill for consideration. Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill is now considered read and open for amendment at any point. I recognize myself for 5 minutes on the bill. First, I want to thank Water Resources and Subcommittee Chairman, Mr. Rouser, and the Aviation Subcommittee Chair, Mr. Graves, for introducing H.R. 1152, the Water Quality Certification and Energy Project Improvement Act of 2023. The bill clarifies the scope of water quality certification project or process under Section 401 of the Clean Water Act. On several occasions, we have seen the Section 401 permitting process abused, hijacked, and block important energy projects. The last thing this country needs is to be dependent on foreign energy, especially when we can produce and distribute energy right here and maintain water quality standards at the same time. This bill provides clarity to Section 401 and brings its focus back to the clear intent of the law. I urge my colleagues to support the bill and now recognize Mr. Larson for 5 minutes for his statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As noted earlier, last Congress, the House and Senate on a bipartisan basis enacted the single largest investment to restore, upgrade, and advance our nation's interconnected infrastructure networks, the largest investment in over a generation. In the first year of the bipartisan infrastructure law, the administration announced over $185 billion in funding and over 6,900 specific projects reaching 4,000 communities across all 50 states, the D.C., and the territories. However, equally as important to putting this investment to work is a robust partnership between the federal government, the states, and local partners to ensure these projects blend seamlessly with state and local requirements and have local community buy-in before they are implemented. To be effective, that process must be transparent and built on mutual trust between the parties, because any effort to force that process is often met with opposition, delay, and litigation. Yet this legislation is another misguided attempt to undermine the current federal-state partnership to protect water quality and is likely to slow implementation of critical infrastructure investment. For almost 50 years, Section 401 of the Clean Water Act has provided individual states the final word on projects or activities that may adversely impact state water quality. This has allowed states to review and to approve, condition, or deny projects or activities in their state if that project or activity requires a federal license or approval. As noted by a witness at the recent Water Resources and Environment Subcommittee hearing, Section 401 gives states the power to protect their water quality, gives states the power to condition projects within their borders, and gives states the power to prevent harm to states' environmental health and the health of its citizens. For decades, this authority has operated without much fanfare or concern. Yet in recent years, there's been a concerted effort by some to limit state authority over water quality interests under Section 401. First, the previous administration completely upended state authority by rewriting Section 401 rules to allow the federal government and business to override states' concerns over potential development within their borders. My home state of Washington has been at the forefront of effective use of Section 401 to protect its interests and has joined with several other states in challenging the legality of that previous rulemaking. And now we're considering a new legislative proposal to similarly weaken state authority. I'm opposed to this proposal for several reasons. First, I'm opposed to moving forward on this legislative proposal with minimal notice to the minority or public hearings on legislation which was just introduced last week. I also oppose this bill because, in my view, it needlessly narrows the scope of projects and activities that states are authorized to review, restricts the conditions a state may require on a project or activity, and limits the amount of time for a state to approve, condition, or deny the project or activity. This bill needlessly limits a state's ability to protect its own water bodies and make sure they're available for critical uses such as public drinking water supply, recreation, agricultural, industrial purposes, and the protection of fish, shellfish, and wildlife. To those here today who are quick to defend states' rights, this bill completely upends the underlying federal-state balance envisioned in the Clean Water Act and would allow outside interests to veto state efforts to protect the quality of its waters and the health of its citizens. To those who support this proposal to accelerate permit reviews, this bill is likely to complicate or lengthen the review process, as states are forced to deny project requests due to shortened and flexible deadlines that might conflict with the state public engagement laws or do not allow sufficient time for states to gather adequate information on project impacts. And to those who believe this legislation will reduce the potential for litigation, again, the opposite will be true, as states and regulated entities are now forced to define by lawsuits the new rules governing state approval or denial of potential projects and activities. So I believe this bill needlessly upends decades of partnership between national and state interests, local interests, tribal interests, in order to protect the water quality, the environment, and the public health of citizens. It also creates more litigation risk and uncertainty as we undertake critical investment in our nation's infrastructure network. Therefore, Mr. Chair, I have to oppose this legislation and call on colleagues to oppose it. With that, I yield back.
I now recognize Water Resources Subcommittee Chair, Mr. Rouser. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm proud to support H.R. 1152, which I introduced along with my friend from Louisiana, Garrett Graves. And I might add that this is just the beginning of permitting reform this Congress. I know there's a lot of folks out there that are eager to tackle this a little more as we move forward, and we certainly will. This bill is necessary because it helps to promote development of our nation's energy infrastructure at a critical time for energy production and distribution. It does so by streamlining the permitting process for critical energy infrastructure projects subject to Section 401 of the Clean Water Act, while ensuring water quality is truly the focus. The permitting process, especially for energy infrastructure projects, needs to be fixed. The various permitting hoops that project sponsors have to jump through are extremely burdensome, and as a result, the needs of the American people are being shelved due to the regulatory quagmire. Section 401 requires that applicants seeking a federal permit or license for activity that may result in discharge into navigable waters obtain a water quality certification from a state or tribe. Many vital projects require these water quality certifications, including those needing permits under Section 402 of the Clean Water Act for discharge of point source pollutants, Section 404 for discharges of dredged or fill material, and the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, for hydropower facilities and natural gas pipelines. These certifications are granted or denied by the states or tribes where the discharge may occur, and this is where the problem lies. Recently, some states have been disregarding the congressional intent of Section 401 and operating against the spirit of cooperative federalism that governs Section 401 and the Clean Water Act as a whole. Instead of fairly analyzing a project based on the federal standards set forth in the Act, states on the East and West Coast have increasingly weaponized Section 401 for their own ideological purposes, completely unrelated to water quality. For example, in 2018, New York denied certification for a proposed natural gas pipeline. However, when FERC completed their environmental impact statement on the proposed pipeline, they found that project's plan would result in only less than significant levels of impact. Don't get any better than that. This is far from the only example. In 2019, Oregon refused to grant certification to a liquefied natural gas export facility. In this case, although the Army Corps of Engineers had deemed the project's application as complete and the sponsors had provided all necessary materials, the state deemed the materials incomplete multiple times. By the time the state acknowledged that the project provided a complete set of materials, they denied the certification, citing a lack of time to review the completed application materials. Unbelievable. To reiterate, these projects were not denied because of genuine water quality concerns, but because these states wanted to veto construction of these important energy projects for rigid ideological purposes. So I was pleased in 2020 when the Trump administration issued the Clean Water Act Section 401 certification rule in response to these actions of these activist states. The rule increased the predictability and timeliness of Section 401 certifications while ensuring that the goals of cooperative federalism and water quality were met. Unfortunately, this administration has taken steps to undermine the rule, with EPA saying a replacement of the 2020 rule is expected this spring. The administration's actions here highlight and underscore the need to pass this legislation now. And as I continue to say, regulations of any kind should be simple and straightforward and comply with common sense, which inherently makes them more effective and enforceable so that the environment is protected while simultaneously facilitating good projects that are much needed. There should be no room for activist bureaucrats to insert their own bias and manipulate the law to fit their own political purposes. And at a time when American energy production and distribution is under tremendous assault from some in this country, this bill takes steps to ensure that energy infrastructure projects can and should be constructed for the benefit of all Americans. Additionally, Section 401 is about issuing water quality certifications, and this bill clarifies that the emphasis is on just that, water quality. This is common sense legislation that simply tells state regulators to be transparent and open about what they need for a project to be brought online and to keep the focus of the Clean Water Act within the scope of congressional intent and not manipulated to suit a bias. I urge my colleagues to support this bill. And Mr. Chairman, I also have, for the record, I'd like to submit by unanimous consent, a letter from the International Union of Operating Engineers in support of this bill. I yield back.
I now recognize Subcommittee Ranking Member Ms. Napolitano for her statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I proudly rise in strong opposition to H.R. 1152, the second attempt in this same markup to weaken our Clean Water Act protections. This bill, like the last resolution, lets polluters off the hook for harmful actions and damaging impacts to our rivers, lakes, and streams that our local communities rely on for clean water and safe drinking water. Section 401 of the Clean Water Act is a key mechanism for states and tribes to evaluate projects that cross within their borders and have an impact on the water and environment. For decades, Section 401 has been a successful example of cooperative federalism while preventing state authority to manage their natural resources. Section 401 has been well-supported, effective tool since the beginning of the Clean Water Act, but the Trump administration found a way to make it escapable for the failure of senseless mega projects. This changes in bill will tie the hands of states and tribes seeking to preserve stream flow for their water supply to prevent runoff and water pollution, and to minimize impacts to flood preventing wetlands. It goes against the Clean Water Act's rights of states to prevent, reduce, and eliminate pollution. In California, this bill will have huge impacts. For one, limiting analysis to only discharges could mean the state would be unable to consider the impact of the whole project, such as increasing impervious surfaces or considering downstream effects. Our state is trying to preserve every drop of water we can get, yet this bill will stop my state from protecting the water supply from the adverse impacts of projects pursued by out-of-state interests. I have a letter for the record, if you will, from the states of California, New York, and Washington in opposition.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. Second, this bill places arbitrary and likely impossible timelines on states to act on permit requests. Despite how complicated or huge a project might be, this bill will severely limit the time allotted for the state to review its impacts. My friends across the aisle may not realize this, but this bill may lead to greater numbers of project rejections as the state is pressured to respond without the time to fully analyze the project. This bill is another attempt to gut the Clean Water Act and allows polluters and industry to act without repercussion. We must defend human health, our economy, and natural environment and oppose this damaging bill that will harm local communities. After all, we're here to represent the public. I strongly oppose 1152, urging my colleagues to do the same. I yield back.
Anyone else? Seeing no further speakers, we'll proceed to amendments on H.R. 1152. We're now considering the bill for amendment. Mr. Graves, Louisiana, you seek recognition.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Excuse me. Mr. Chairman, first of all, I want to thank Mr. Rouser for bringing this bill up. I think that it's absolutely critical that we keep the confines of the delegated authority or the consideration of states between the guardrails. Yep. Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate
Yes,
the
I
amendment.
do.
Amendment to the H.R. 1152 offered by Mr. Graves of Louisiana, number 013.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. Mr. Graves, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
What I just said.
Or whatever is subtracted off of what you've already said.
Mr. Chairman, I want to thank Mr. Rouser. I think it's really important that as we move forward, particularly in interstate projects, that the states truly keep their decisions within the guardrails, which is impact on water quality. And we've seen way too many times where decisions of states have gone well beyond the confines of what 401 was really intended to do. Most importantly, Mr. Chairman, it's about the consequences. The consequences that we've seen over and over again have been that important infrastructure projects have been stopped which has resulted in some cases in crazy things like us literally, I say us, I don't want to say us, with I'll say the people that have forced these decisions into having to buy liquefied natural gas from Vladimir Putin, literally having Putin troll the United States on Twitter because he's coming in and bailing us out because 401 has been misused and stopped pipeline projects and others from moving forward. So again, Mr. Chairman, I want to thank Mr. Rouser for his leadership on this issue. Mr. Chairman, in regard to the amendment that we have, a little bit different issue, but this has to do with regulatory certainty. We have seen that under general authority provided under the Clean Water Act that agencies under different administrations have had gaps in general permit authority. And so what this would do is it would actually provide specificity. This amendment would provide specificity and require that you have contiguous regulatory certainty or permitting certainty to where when folks are trying to carry out permits, they're clear on what the rules are. I want to be clear, Mr. Chairman, there's nothing in this amendment that would tie the hands of the agencies in terms of changing permit conditions or doing anything that they want to do under the law in regard to the conditions on the permits. But it would require that you have permit certainty or continuity and not have these gaps that then causes delays in projects or preventing projects from being able to move forward. So, Mr. Chairman, I think this is an important clarification or specificity added to the Clean Water Act, and I'll yield back, but I also may be willing to withdraw.
Is there any further discussion on the amendment?
Mr. Chair, I just want to give the gentleman from Louisiana the opportunity to withdraw his amendment so we can move on to the other amendments.
I will take your endorsement of this amendment, Mr. Larson.
Oh, I'm only regretting the opportunity to tell you how much I honor and respect you before I speak against it, but you're withdrawing, so no one needs the speeches.
Thank you, Mr. Larson. I look forward to our discussion, but Mr. Larson, you're correct in that I did want to highlight this issue. I think it's very important. It is causing gaps in certainty and delaying projects, and I will ask unanimous consent to withdraw the amendment, but I do look forward to having bipartisan discussion on this issue.
Without objection, that is so ordered, and I appreciate the importance of this and look forward to working with you as we move items to the floor. Next, Mr. Sykes, you seek recognition?
Thank
Ms.
you.
Sykes, I mean.
Thank you, Mr.
And I
Chair.
apologize, too, if I get somebody's name wrong, because I'm still trying to learn everybody's name. But Ms. Sykes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment restores the state's ability to consider the impacts that certain.
You have, offer your amendment, and then I'll have them designate it, and then I'll let you speak.
I have an amendment.
Clerk,
Mr.
designate
Chair.
the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 1152, offered by Mrs. Sykes of Ohio, number 001.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. Ms. Sykes is recognized for 5 minutes on your statement. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My amendment restores states' abilities to consider the impact that certain projects will have during the water quality certification process. Many of us here today can agree that we must ensure the federal government is approving projects as safely and as expeditiously as possible, especially considering when it pertains to domestic energy production. But we cannot sacrifice the long-term health and safety of our communities in the name of simply efficiency. That's why I cannot support this legislation in its current form. If this legislation were to become law, it would significantly narrow the scope of federally permitted and licensed projects that states and tribes are required to approve. Mr. Chairman, I'm the only member on this committee representing the state of Ohio. And on behalf of my constituents in Ohio's 13th district, as well as the state of Ohio, we take concern with any legislation that limits the ability of a government to protect the community's drinking water. I have witnessed firsthand the dangers of legislation like this on our waterways. And in the past 2 weeks, I have met with United States and Ohio environmental protection agencies on the ground in East Palestine to assess the long-term impacts of the Norfolk Southern negligent derailment and subsequent chemical spill we have had on our region's drinking water and in the Ohio River. And Mr. Chairman, if I may take a point of personal privilege, I'd like to thank my colleague, the gentleman from Texas, Chairman Niels, for his efforts in visiting East Palestine to see what is happening on the ground, and for other members who have offered their thoughts and continue to commit to holding Norfolk Southern accountable for their negligent behavior. Mr. Chairman, H.R. 1152 would prevent states like Ohio and so many others from taking any of the following into consideration as the basis for their objections: the potential for a pipeline to leak dangerous chemicals into the groundwater, any toxic runoff from an approved factory, or pollution in our waterways that results from a train derailment. Mr. Chairman, I'll say that again. H.R. 1152 would prevent states like Ohio and Pennsylvania and so many others from taking any of the following actions into consideration as the basis of their objections: emphasis on polluting our waterways that results from a trail derailment. Mr. Chairman, that is why I'm offering this amendment today, which will restore some of the state's ability to protect its drinking water. This amendment is a compromise. It does not totally gut the intention of the bill, but also allows for states to have the right to intercede as needed to protect their citizens and the water supply. I strongly believe our constituents sent us here to develop bipartisan solutions and not pursue partisan politics. There is nothing partisan about wanting to make sure our children and our neighbors can drink a glass of water without worrying if it's polluted with chemicals like vinyl chloride, which can lead to hepatotoxicity and hepatic cancers, including angiosarcoma, portal hypertension, and even cirrhosis. And while we've heard a lot about regulatory certainty, what about the certainty of turning on a tap and not drinking cancerous water? There is nothing partisan about wanting to make sure our local governments can safeguard their communities, and states have the rights to protect its citizen and its waterways. Mr. Chairman, this is not a partisan issue. This is a human issue, an issue that impacts all of us, even if it is just one of us. Mr. Chair, I've been to East Palestine twice. And beyond the immediate need for care and concern of the citizens in this immediate emergency of the trail derailment, the message that resonates very clear beyond holding Norfolk Southern accountable is that they do not want this to happen to anyone else, and they do not want to be concerned about their water quality as their families make the decision whether or not to stay or to leave. In a bipartisan way, Mr. Chair, the governors of Ohio, mine a Republican, and Pennsylvania, a Democrat, asked Congress to act to secure the safety of the waterways in their state. I highly doubt that making it more difficult for them to object from projects that could pollute our waterways after a train derailment is what they have asked us to do. So for these reasons, I cannot in good conscience vote for this bill, and I encourage all of my colleagues to vote in favor of my amendment, which would protect our communities' access to clean drinking water, and I yield back the balance of my time.
I now recognize Mr. Rouser, the subcommittee chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I certainly share Ms. Sykes' desire to protect clean water, as we all do, but do not support this amendment. This amendment would gut an important provision from the bill and allow certain activist states to deny projects they are ideologically opposed to by citing reasons outside of the Clean Water Act. In no place does this underlying bill weaken or reduce clean water standards as set forth under the Clean Water Act. In no place does this legislation disallow or block states from setting water quality standards as high as they see fit, as outlined under the Clean Water Act. In no place does this legislation prevent or interfere with the state's ability to set its own water quality standards under any laws that it chooses to set for itself. What the legislation does do is maintain that if a state is going to deny certification under Section 401 of the Clean Water Act, then it must do so using criteria from the Clean Water Act. This amendment reopens the door for states to use criteria outside of the Clean Water Act to disapprove a project under the Clean Water Act, which brings us right back to square one. As referenced above, states have the authority to regulate activity within their own borders by passing their own state environmental laws, and H.R. 1152, this underlying bill, recognizes that authority. With that, I urge my colleagues to oppose the amendment, and I yield back.
Now I recognize Mr. Larson for a statement on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I support the amendment offered by Ms. Sykes of Ohio. By now, we've all seen pictures of the aftermath of East Palestine, Ohio, and the train derailment. Derailment resulted in the discharges of tens of thousands of gallons of vinyl chloride, butyl acrylate, and a lot of other toxic chemicals that I cannot pronounce that went into the surrounding streams and the environment. These chemicals then continue to move downstream, where they are later released into the Ohio River, killing thousands of fish and other aquatic wildlife along the way. Now, as the chemical plume moved unabated downstream, it forced cities as far away as Cleveland, Columbus, Ohio, Charleston, West Virginia, Louisville, Kentucky, to monitor its movement and provide alternative drinking water sources to its local residents. This has a huge impact on families living in the area. Clearly, this disaster, which the NTSB initially determined to be 100% preventable, will be something that we have to monitor for some time. However, it also highlights some of the concerns we have that the bill would undermine state authority to protect its water quality and the health of its citizens by restricting the state's ability to review and prevent potential future chemical releases into nearby streams. So I support the representative's amendment because it recognizes the inherent interests of states to ensure that projects and activities that take place within their borders are safe, protect the state's water quality, and protect the health of its citizens. The underlying bill would eliminate these protections in the name of expedience. However, I think examples outlined by Representative Sykes show the consequences that can happen if we fail to take the necessary precautions to protect our citizens from potential catastrophes, such as those faced by the residents of East Palestine and surrounding communities. We need to ensure that the federal government and the states have the tools to learn from the train derailment and to ensure that similar incidents and the associated consequences to the health of our communities and our constituents do not happen again. This amendment will ensure that these tools remain in place. I support the amendment. I ask all my colleagues to support the amendment. With that, I yield back.
Do any other members seek recognition on Ms. Sykes' amendment? Are there any amendments to the amendment? Seeing none, I recognize myself for 5 minutes to speak on the amendment. Unfortunately, I cannot support this amendment. I do believe that it would undermine the purpose of the bill by allowing anti-energy states to use potentially arbitrary reasons outside of the Clean Water Act to deny a project. And I would urge my colleagues to oppose the amendment. And with that, I would yield back. Are there any further speakers on the amendment? Just to make sure. Seeing none, the question is on the amendment. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All opposed signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chairs, the nays have it. A requested vote has been called. As previously announced, pursuant to Committee Rule 6F, further proceedings on the question are postponed. Are there any further amendments? Mr. Stauber?
Mr. Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 1152, offered by Mr. Stauber, number 005.
The amendment will be considered as read. Mr. Stauber, you're recognized for 5 minutes to speak on the amendment.
Thank you, Chairman Graves and Ranking Member Larson. I rise today in support of my amendment, number 3, to H.R. 1152, the Water Quality Certification and Energy Project Improvement Act of 2023, legislation I support and I look forward to voting in favor of. This amendment addresses a pressing and topical issue. For the first time in the history of the Clean Water Act, the U.S. Army Corps is convening a Section 401A2 hearing between the EPA and a project sponsor. Polymet Mining is proposing a copper, nickel, cobalt, and platinum group metal mining project in my district and purchased an existing industrial site used by an iron mining company. For those that don't know, my district alone accounts for 95% of America's nickel reserve, 88% of America's cobalt reserve, 75% of our platinum group metals, and more than 1/3 of our copper. Northern Minnesota has the resources, the mining know-how, and workforce to be the mineral supplier for everything from fighter jet targeting systems to wind turbines to transmission lines to MRI machines and much, much more. Believe it or not, Mr. Chair, Polymet is on year 20 of permitting and litigation. The company has signed a project labor agreement years ago with the Iron Range Building and Construction Trades. They have won every single lawsuit against. In fact, the water to be used by Polymet in their plan is actually recycled so clean, they have to re-mineralize it every time. And Joe Biden actually chose to remand a Clean Water Act permit granted when he was vice president under the Obama administration. And he is now using his politicized EPA to force the Army Corps to hold this hearing. Don't get me wrong, I commend the Army Corps on the work they have done. I know they will offer a fair process. However, it took nearly a year to decide to use this statute and conduct the hearing. Now we have no idea if we're even close to an outcome. Never-ending delays. Therefore, my amendment requires the federal government and the state to agree to a timeline for the hearing with the project sponsor. Mr. Chair, because I support the underlying legislation and recognize the desperate need for its passage, I am withdrawing this amendment at this time.
Thank you, Mr. Stauber. I appreciate how important this issue is, and I look forward to working with you in the future. Are there any other further amendments on 152? And I recognize Mr. Stauber.
Mr. Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk, please designate the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 1152, offered by Mr. Stauber, number 006.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. Mr. Stauber, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Graves. Ranking Member Larson, I rise today in support of my amendment number 4 to H.R. 1152, the Water Quality Certification and Energy Project Improvement Act of 2023. This administration's anti-mining stance undermines its own energy infrastructure goals. And unfortunately, the 404C veto authority, otherwise known as the EPA veto, is a hammer used to crush American mineral development. Every single member on this dais hopefully agrees that there is no clean energy without domestic mining. Import reliance has failed us in the past and will fail us again. Recycling can be a small part of the equation, but there are simply not enough minerals in circulation right now to come even close to our goals. Right now, this administration's strategy is to import these minerals from abroad. No matter the use of child slave labor, no matter the lack of environmental protections, they get minerals from countries for cheap, put them in our cell phones and solar panels, and then they look the other way while they pat themselves on the back for killing American mining jobs. The EPA veto has been used several times in the past in West Virginia, Alaska, Mississippi, Colorado, and more. But recently, it's only been used to stop mining. So let's put aside for a moment the projects in particular and evaluate the policy itself. The EPA veto is a lever an activist administrator can pull to kill virtually any project it wants. This EPA has illustrated a sustained favoritism towards the radical, keep-it-in-the-ground activists while strong-arming American workers and American resources. Even if a project meets or exceeds all standards, this EPA will always choose minerals from abroad instead of minerals here at home. So my amendment simply requires consultation across several sectors of the federal government to verify that we are not endangering our access to critical minerals, our access to the materials we need for a robust energy grid or the materials we need for our national defense. However, I understand the underlying bill may not be the most appropriate vehicle. So therefore, Mr. Chair, I withdraw my amendment, but wish to continue the conversation surrounding the implications of affording an activist administration unrestrained veto authority, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Stauber, and look forward to working with you on that. I now recognize Mr. Huffman for an amendment.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do have an amendment at the desk.
Designate, please.
Amendment to H.R. 1152, offered by Mr. Huffman, number 014.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read. Mr. Huffman, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The ranking member and others have explained why the underlying bill here is really an unfortunate overreach. It would blow up a model of cooperative federalism that has worked for 50 years. It would significantly cut out states and tribes from the Clean Water Act permitting process, and it wouldn't really achieve the kind of certainty and streamlining that some have said they want, because, as the ranking member explained, it would simply force states to litigate instead of to be partners in the permitting process. But if my colleagues are absolutely sure that they want to throw states under the bus like this, I want to give them a chance to at least clarify that they don't want to throw tribes under the bus too. Many of us claim to support tribal sovereignty, claim to respect
the Native American tribes that we represent. I have 25 federally recognized tribes in my district. Many of them have used Section 401 of the Clean Water Act to protect their rights to clean water, to protect fisheries, to block polluting and destructive industries which may harm their cultural resources. And so I have an amendment that is essentially a under-the-bus test. Maybe you do want to throw states under the bus, but I want to give you a chance, in case you didn't realize you were doing this to tribes as well, to take tribes out of that situation. If you do intend to throw tribes under the bus too, by all means vote no on my amendment. But if you want to make a bad bill a little better and walk the walk on actually caring about tribes and tribal sovereignty and respecting tribes, you should vote yes on this amendment. And with that, I yield back.
Do any other member wish to be recognized on the amendment?
Mr. Chairman.
Rouser.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm sorry to say I have to oppose the amendment from a friend from California. The principles of the Clean Water Act apply to all Americans, no matter where you live or what state or territory you may live in. Under the Clean Water Act, tribes are treated no different than states. Tribes, just like states, have legal tools and options to govern their water quality as they see fit. Tribes are also able to utilize federal tribal consultation to provide legally required input into federal decisions that would affect them. So it's a real slippery slope to start applying the Clean Water Act differently to different groups of people in the country. For many communities, especially low-income ones, adhering to stringent clean water standards set by the federal government can be a burden. However, they do it anyway. Given tribal sovereignty is not undercut by the CWA, to be fair to all, under this premise of this amendment, you would naturally apply to any community, not just tribal communities. And I want to make this point. I don't think my friends on the other side of the aisle would be very supportive of allowing any community to exempt themselves from the federal water quality standards on the grounds that it puts a strain on their resources or for any other reason. So consistency, I think, is really important. Let's not start treating groups of Americans differently under the Clean Water Act. With that, I urge my colleagues to oppose the amendment.
Mr. Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I rise in support of the amendment that Representative Huffman has offered. Section 401 provides authorized tribes the same legal rights as states to review and grant, condition, or deny applications for projects or activities that may cause a discharge to waters of the U.S. under the jurisdiction of the tribe. With this authority, a tribe can enforce compliance with the tribe's EPA-approved water quality standards. Tribes have successfully utilized their Section 401 certification authority to protect tribal interests and designated uses of tribal waters. However, this committee has been presented with no evidence that tribes have abused this authority or have caused unreasonable delays or conditions to potential projects or activities to warrant the changes envisioned in this legislation. Therefore, I do support this amendment, which affirms that nothing in this legislation or amendments made by this legislation affect any tribal rights or authorities under the Clean Water Act, including authority to review, approve, condition, or deny any project or activity in order to protect tribal treaty rights, including water rights, fishing rights, and cultural resources. And I ask all my colleagues in the committee to support this amendment. With that, I yield back.
Anyone else wish to be heard on the amendment? Are there any amendments to the amendment? Seeing none, I recognize myself for 5 minutes. Unfortunately, Mr. Huffman, I can't support this amendment. I think that going down this path would be very problematic if we start exempting different groups from the requirements under the Clean Water Act. And with that, I would urge my colleagues to oppose the amendment. Are there any other speakers on the amendment? Seeing none, the question is on the amendment. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All opposed signify by saying nay.
Request the yeas and nays, Mr. Chairman.
The yeas and nays have been requested. As previously announced, pursuant to Committee Rule 6F, further proceedings on the question are postponed. So, nothing else? Okay.
Are there any further amendments to the bill?
Are there any further amendments to the bill? Seeing none. Okay, let everybody know that, or let your bosses know that we're getting ready to vote, so they can get down here. The committee previously postponed proceedings on House Joint Resolution 27 and H.R. 1152. The question now is on House Joint Resolution 27, previously postponed, on which a recorded vote was ordered, which was agreed to by voice vote. Is a recorded vote still requested?
Yes.
A recorded vote is still requested. The clerk, please call the roll.
Chairman Graves.
Aye.
Chairman Graves votes aye. Ranking Member Larson. Ranking Member Larson votes no. Mr. Crawford. Ms. Norton.
Norton votes no.
Ms. Norton votes no. Mr. Webster of Florida. Mr. Webster of Florida votes yea. Mrs. Napolitano.
No.
Mrs. Napolitano votes no. Mr. Massey. Mr. Cohen. Mr. Perry. Mr. Perry votes aye. Mr. Garamendi. Mr. Garamendi votes no. Mr. Graves of Louisiana. I'm sorry. Apologies. Mr. Babin.
Babin votes aye.
Mr. Babin votes aye. Mr. Johnson of Georgia. Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes no. Mr. Graves of Louisiana. Mr. Carson. Mr. Carson votes no. Mr. Rouser.
Aye.
Mr. Rouser votes aye. Ms. Titus. Ms. Titus votes no. Mr. Bost. Mr. Bost votes aye. Mr. Huffman.
No.
Mr. Huffman votes no. Mr. LaMalfa. Mr. LaMalfa votes aye. Ms. Brownlee. Ms. Brownlee votes no. Mr. Westerman. Ms. Wilson of Florida. Mr. Mast. Mr. Payne.
No.
Mr. Payne votes no. Mrs. Gonzalez-Colon.
Aye.
Mrs. Gonzalez-Colon votes aye. Mr. Desagne.
No.
Mr. Desagne votes no. Mr. Stauber.
Aye.
Mr. Stauber votes aye. Mr. Carbajal.
No.
Mr. Carbajal votes no. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Aye. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota votes aye. Mr. Stanton.
No.
Mr. Stanton votes no. Mr. Westerman. Ms. Wilson of Florida. Mr. Burchett. Mr. Allred.
No.
Mr. Allred votes no. Mr. Van Drew.
Aye.
Mr. Van Drew votes aye. Ms. Davids of Kansas.
No.
Ms. Davids of Kansas votes no. Mr. Nels.
Aye.
Mr. Nels votes aye. Mr. Garcia of Illinois. Mr. Gooden of Texas. Mr. Pappas. Mr. Pappas votes no. Mr. Mann.
Aye.
Mr. Mann votes aye. Mr. Moulton. Mr. Owens. Mr. Owens votes aye. Mr. Auchincloss. Mr. Yakum.
Aye.
Mr. Yakum votes aye. Ms. Strickland. Ms. Strickland votes no. Mrs. Chavez de Reamer. Mr. Carter of Louisiana. Mr. Edwards. Aye. Mr. Edwards votes aye. Mr. Ryan.
No.
Mr. Ryan votes no. Mr. Kane of New Jersey.
Aye.
Mr. Kane of New Jersey votes aye. Mrs. Peltola.
No.
Mrs. Peltola votes no. Mr. D'Esposito. Mr. Menendez.
No.
Mr. Menendez votes no. Mr. Burleson.
Aye.
Mr. Burleson votes aye. Ms. Hoyle of Oregon.
No.
Ms. Hoyle of Oregon votes no. Mr. James.
Aye.
Mr. James votes aye. Mrs. Sykes. No. Mrs. Sykes votes no. Mr. Van Orden.
Aye.
Mr. Van Orden votes aye. Mrs. Skolton.
No.
Mrs. Skolton votes no. Mr. Williams of New York. Mrs. Fushi.
No.
Mrs. Fushi votes no. Mr. Molinaro.
Aye.
Mr. Molinaro votes aye. Mr. Collins.
Aye.
Mr. Collins votes aye. Mr. Ezell? Mr. Ezell votes aye. Mr. Duarte?
Aye.
Mr. Duarte votes aye. Mr. Bean of Florida?
Aye.
Mr. Bean of Florida votes aye. Mr. Crawford?
Call those who didn't respond. Will you pull the mic closer to you as well?
Mr.
And please call
Crawford?
those who didn't respond.
Mr. Crawford votes aye. Mr. Massey?
Massey votes aye.
Mr. Massey votes aye. Mr. Cohen? Mr. Graves of Louisiana? Mr. Westerman? Ms. Wilson of Florida? Mr. Mast? Mr. Burchett? Mr. Garcia of Illinois? Mr. Gooden of Texas?
Aye.
Mr. Gooden of Texas votes aye. Mr. Moulton? Mr. Auchincloss? Mrs. Chavez DeReamer? Mr. Carter of Louisiana? Mr. D'Esposito? Mr. Williams of New York?
Aye.
Mr. Williams of New York votes aye.
Any other members wish to be recorded? Mr. Graves?
Mr. Graves of Louisiana votes aye.
Do all members who wish to be recorded, are they recorded? Are you recorded? Please announce the vote.
On that vote, Mr. Chairman, there were 30 yeas and 22 noes.
The resolution is agreed to and ordered favorably reported from the House. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Okay, next, the question is now on amendments to House Resolution 1152, 1152, previously postponed. First, we're going to vote on the amendment offered by Ms. Sykes to 1152, on which a recorded vote was ordered, which was not agreed to by voice vote. Is a recorded vote still requested? Yes, it is. A recorded vote is requested.
Chairman Graves?
No.
Chairman Graves votes no. Ranking Member Larson?
Yes.
Ranking Member Larson votes aye. Mr. Crawford?
No.
Mr. Crawford votes no. Ms. Norton?
Norton votes yes.
Ms. Norton votes aye. Mr. Webster of Florida? Mr. Webster of Florida votes no. Mrs. Napolitano?
Yes.
Mrs. Napolitano votes aye. Mr. Massey? Mr. Massey votes no. Mr. Cohen? Mr. Cohen votes aye. Mr. Perry? Mr. Perry votes no. Mr. Garamendi? Mr. Garamendi votes aye. Mr. Babin?
No.
Mr. Babin votes no. Mr. Johnson of Georgia? Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes aye. Mr. Graves of Louisiana? Mr. Graves of Louisiana votes no. Mr. Carson? Mr. Carson votes no. Mr. Rouser?
No.
Mr. Rouser votes no. Ms. Titus? Ms. Titus votes aye. Mr. Bost? Mr. Huffman? Mr. Huffman votes aye. Mr. LaMalfa? Mr. LaMalfa votes no. Ms. Brownlee? Ms. Brownlee votes aye. Mr. Westerman? Ms. Wilson of Florida? Mr. Mast? Mr. Payne? Mr. Payne votes aye. Mrs. Gonzalez-Colon?
No.
Mrs. Gonzalez-Colon votes no. Mr. DeSagne? Mr. DeSagne votes aye. Mr. Stauber?
No.
Mr. Stauber votes no. Mr. Carbajal?
Aye.
Mr. Carbajal votes aye. Mr. Burchett? Mr. Burchett votes no. Mr. Stanton? Mr. Stanton votes aye. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota? Mr. Johnson of South Dakota votes no. Mr. Allred?
Aye.
Mr. Allred votes aye. Mr. Van Drew? Mr. Van Drew votes no. Ms. Davids of Kansas?
Aye.
Ms. Davids of Kansas votes aye. Mr. Nels? Mr. Nels votes no. Mr. Garcia of Illinois? Mr. Gooden of Texas?
No. No.
Mr. Gooden of Texas votes no. Mr. Pappas? Mr. Pappas votes aye. Mr. Mann?
No.
Mr. Mann votes no. Mr. Moulton? Mr. Owens. Mr. Owens votes no. Mr. Auchincloss.
Yes.
Mr. Auchincloss votes aye. Mr. Yakum.
No.
Mr. Yakum votes no. Ms. Strickland. Ms. Strickland votes aye. Mrs. Chavez DeRemer. Mr. Carter of Louisiana. Mr. Edwards. No. Mr. Edwards votes no. Mr. Ryan.
Aye.
Mr. Ryan votes aye. Mr. Kane of New Jersey.
No.
Mr. Kane of New Jersey votes no. Mrs. Peltola.
Yes.
Mrs. Peltola votes aye. Mr. Diaz-Zito. Mr. Menendez.
Aye.
Mr. Menendez votes aye. Mr. Burleson. Mr. Burleson votes no. Ms. Hoyle of Oregon. Ms. Hoyle of Oregon votes aye. Mr. James.
No.
Mr. James votes no. Mrs. Sykes.
Aye.
Mrs. Sykes votes aye. Mr. Van Orden.
No.
Mr. Van Orden votes no. Ms. Skolton.
Yes.
Ms. Skolton votes aye. Mr. Williams of New York.
No.
Mr. Williams of New York votes no. Mrs. Fushi.
Aye.
Mrs. Fushi votes aye. Mr. Molinaro.
No.
Mr. Molinaro votes no. Mr. Collins.
No.
Mr. Collins votes no. Mr. Ezell.
No.
Mr. Ezell votes no. Mr. Duarte.
No.
Mr. Duarte votes no. Mr. Bean of Florida. Mr. Bean of Florida votes no. Mr. Bost. Mr. Bost votes no. Mr. Westerman. Mr. Westerman votes no. Ms. Wilson of Florida. Mr. Mast. Mr. Garcia of Illinois. Mr. Moulton. Mrs. Chavez DeRemer. Mr. Carter of Louisiana. Mr. Desposito.
Does anyone else wish to be recorded?
Mr. Carson votes aye.
Any other members wish to be recorded? Report the vote.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 9 yeas and 40 nays.
Okay,
I
There were
object.
19 ayes.
Say it one more time.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 19 ayes and 40 noes.
Hey, the amendment's not agreed to.
Mr. Chair, I'd
Still
be,
can't be right.
it still can't be right. I just prefer it be accurate. I'm not objecting to the fact we lost the amendment, but it's important that we have the vote count right. Yeah, I think Burchett wanted to change his vote too, so.
You can ask for a motion to reconsider and redo the vote if you want.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 32 noes and 20 ayes.
Mr. Chair, can we get a revote on this? Is that possible? That's
Ask
just,
for a ask for a motion to reconsider the vote, and the clerk will call the roll.
for me?
He has to do it because we were prevailing.
I'll move that we reconsider the vote.
On that vote, there were 26
No,
ayes.
clerk will
No, the
recall
clerk, we're going to revote. So call the roll.
Chairman Graves.
No.
Chairman Graves votes no. Ranking Member Larson.
Aye.
Ranking Member Larson votes aye. Mr. Crawford.
No.
Mr. Crawford votes no. Ms. Norton.
Aye.
Ms. Norton votes aye. Mr. Webster of Florida. Mr. Webster of Florida votes no. Mrs. Napolitano.
Aye.
Mrs. Napolitano votes aye. Mr. Massey. No. Mr. Massey votes no. Mr. Cohen.
Aye.
Mr. Cohen votes aye. Mr. Perry.
No.
Mr. Perry votes no. Mr. Garamendi. Mr. Garamendi votes aye. Mr. Babin. Mr. Babin votes no. Mr. Johnson of Georgia. Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes aye. Mr. Graves of Louisiana. Mr. Carson. Mr. Carson votes aye. Mr. Rouser. Mr. Rouser votes no. Ms. Titus. Ms. Titus votes aye. Mr. Bost. Mr. Boss votes no. Mr. Huffman. Mr. Huffman votes aye. Mr. LaMalfa. Mr. LaMalfa votes no. Ms. Brownlee. Ms. Brownlee votes aye. Mr. Westerman. Mr. Westerman votes no. Ms. Wilson of Florida. Mr. Mast. Mr. Payne. Mr. Payne votes aye. Mrs. Gonzalez-Colon.
No.
Mrs. Gonzalez-Colon votes no. Mr. DeSagne. Mr. DeSagne votes aye. Mr. Stauber.
No.
Mr. Stauber votes no. Mr. Carbajal.
Aye.
Mr. Carbajal votes aye. Mr. Burchett. Mr. Burchett votes no. Mr. Stanton. Mr. Stanton votes aye. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota votes no. Mr. Allred. Mr. Allred votes aye. Mr. Van Drew. Mr. Van Drew votes no. Ms. Davids of Kansas.
Aye.
Ms. Davids of Kansas votes aye. Mr. Nels. Mr. Nels votes no. Mr. Garcia of Illinois. Mr. Gooden of Texas. Mr. Gooden of Texas votes no. Mr. Pappas. Mr. Pappas votes aye. Mr. Mann.
No.
Mr. Mann votes no. Mr. Moulton. Mr. Owens. Mr. Owens votes no. Mr. Auchincloss. Mr. Auchincloss votes aye. Mr. Yakum.
No.
Mr. Yakum votes no. Ms. Strickland. Ms. Strickland votes aye. Mrs. Chavez-Reamer. Mr. Carter of Louisiana. Mr. Edwards. Mr. Edwards votes no. Mr. Ryan. Mr. Ryan votes aye. Mr. Kane of New Jersey.
No.
Mr. Kane of New Jersey votes no. Mrs. Peltola. Ms. Peltola votes aye. Mr. De-Esposito.
No.
Mr. De-Esposito votes no. Mr. Menendez.
Aye.
Mr. Menendez votes aye. Mr. Burleson. Mr. Burleson votes no. Miss Hoyle of Oregon. Miss Hoyle of Oregon votes aye. Mr. James.
No.
Mr. James votes no. Mrs. Sykes.
Aye.
Mrs. Sykes votes aye. Mr. Van Orden.
No.
Mr. Van Orden votes no. Ms. Colton.
Aye.
Ms. Colton votes aye. Mr. Williams of New York.
No.
Mr. Williams of New York votes no. Mrs. Fushi.
Aye.
Mrs. Fushi votes aye. Mr. Molinaro. Mr. Molinaro votes no. Mr. Collins.
No.
Mr. Collins votes no. Mr. Ezell.
No.
Mr. Ezell votes no. Mr. Duarte.
No.
Mr. Duarte votes no. Mr. Bean of Florida. Mr. Bean of Florida votes no.
Anyone else wish to be recorded? Garrett?
Mr. Graves of Louisiana votes no.
Anyone else wish to be recorded? We're not going to do that again, so make sure we get it right. Anyone else? Please report the vote. Yep.
Ms. Chavez-Reamer is not recorded.
Would you like to be recorded?
I'm a no vote.
Ms. Chavez-Reamer votes no.
Now report the vote.
On that vote, Mr. Chairman, there were 34 noes and 26 ayes.
The amendment is not agreed to. Next, we have the second amendment on 1152, offered by Mr. Huffman, on which a recorded vote was ordered. Is a recorded vote still requested? It is. It is. Recorded vote is recorded. Clerk, please call the roll.
Chairman Graves.
No.
Chairman Graves votes no. Ranking Member Larson.
Yes.
Ranking Member Larson votes aye. Mr. Crawford.
No.
Mr. Crawford votes no. Ms. Norton.
Norton votes aye.
Ms. Norton votes aye. Mr. Webster of Florida. Mr. Webster of Florida votes no. Mrs. Napolitano.
Yay.
Mrs. Napolitano votes aye. Mr. Massey. Mr. Massey votes no. Mr. Cohen. Mr. Cohen votes aye. Mr. Perry. Mr. Perry votes no. Mr. Garamendi. Mr. Garamendi votes aye. Mr. Babin.
No.
Mr. Babin votes no. Mr. Johnson of Georgia. Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes aye. Mr. Graves of Louisiana. Mr. Carson. Mr. Carson votes aye. Mr. Rouser?
No.
Mr. Rouser votes no. Ms. Titus? Ms. Titus votes aye. Mr. Bost? Mr. Bost votes no. Mr. Huffman? Mr. Huffman votes aye. Mr. LaMalfa? Mr. LaMalfa votes no. Ms. Brownlee? Mr. Westerman, Ms. Brownlee votes aye. Mr. Westerman? Mr. Westerman votes no. Ms. Wilson of Florida? Mr. Mast? Mr. Payne? Mr. Payne votes aye. Mrs. Gonzalez-Colon?
No.
Mrs. Gonzalez-Colon votes no. Mr. Desagne? Mr. Desagne votes aye. Mr. Stauber?
No.
Mr. Stauber votes no. Mr. Carbajal? Mr. Burchett?
Aye.
Mr. Carbajal votes aye. Mr. Burchett? Mr. Burchett votes no. Mr. Stanton? Mr. Stanton votes aye. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota? Mr. Johnson of South Dakota votes no. Mr. Allred? Mr. Allred votes aye. Mr. Van Drew? Mr. Van Drew votes no. Ms. Davids of Kansas? Ms. Davids of Kansas votes aye. Mr. Nels? Mr. Nels votes no. Mr. Garcia of Illinois? Mr. Gooden of Texas? Mr. Gooden of Texas votes no. Mr. Pappas? Mr. Pappas votes aye. Mr. Mann?
No.
Mr. Mann votes no. Mr. Moulton? Mr. Owens? Mr. Owens votes no. Mr. Auchincloss? Mr. Auchincloss votes aye. Mr. Yakum?
No.
Mr. Yakum votes no. Ms. Strickland? Ms. Strickland votes aye. Mrs. Chavez-DeRemer?
No.
Mrs. Chavez-DeRemer votes no. Mr. Carter of Louisiana? Mr. Edwards? Mr. Edwards votes no. Mr. Ryan? Mr. Ryan votes aye. Mr. Kane of New Jersey?
No.
Mr. Kane of New Jersey votes no. Mrs. Peltola? Mrs. Peltola votes aye. Mr. Diaz-Posito?
No.
Mr. Diaz-Posito votes no. Mr. Menendez?
Aye.
Mr. Menendez votes aye. Mr. Burleson? Mr. Burleson votes no. Ms. Hoyle of Oregon? Ms. Hoyle of Oregon votes aye. Mr. James?
No.
Mr. James votes no. Mrs. Sykes? Mrs. Sykes votes aye. Mr. Van Orden?
No.
Mr. Van Orden votes no. Mrs. Skolton?
Yes.
Mrs. Skolton votes aye. Mr. Williams of New York?
No.
Mr. Williams of New York votes no. Mrs. Fushi?
Aye.
Mrs. Fushi votes aye. Mr. Molinaro? Mr. Molinaro votes no. Mr. Collins?
No.
Mr. Collins votes no. Mr. Ezell? Mr. Ezell votes no. Mr. Duarte?
No.
Mr. Duarte votes no. Mr. Bean of Florida?
No.
Mr. Bean of Florida votes no. Mr. Graves of Louisiana? Mr. Mast? Ms. Wilson of Florida? Mr. Pappas? Mr. Moulton? Mr. Carter, Louisiana?
Do any other members wish to be recorded? Did we miss anyone?
Mr. Chairman, can I ask how I'm recorded?
I'm sorry, who asked the question?
Pappas.
Mr. Pappas is recorded as aye.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, may Carbajal ask how he's recorded?
Mr. Carbajal is also recorded as aye.
Mr. Mast?
Mr. Mast is not recorded. Mr. Mast votes no.
Does anyone else wish to be recorded? Report the vote.
On that vote, Mr. Chairman, there were 26 ayes and 34 noes.
The amendment is not agreed to. The question is now on the adoption of and favorably reporting of H.R. 1152 to the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye. All opposed, say no.
No.
The ayes appear to have it. The bill is agreed to and ordered favorably to the House. Why do we need a recorded vote? The ayes have it. The bill is favorably reported. All right. I ask unanimous consent that each measure ordered reported today will be reported as a single amendment in the nature of a substitute incorporating any amendments adopted, and without objection, that is so ordered. Would ask unanimous consent that the staff be authorized to make all necessary technical, clarifying, and conforming changes to each of the measures reported today to reflect the actions of the House, and without objection, that is so ordered. Pursuant to House Rule 22, Clause 1, I ask unanimous consent that the chairman or his designee be authorized to offer such motions as may be necessary in the House to go to conference with the Senate on the legislation adopted today in any similar measure. Without objection, that is ordered. I'd ask unanimous consent that the chairman, after consultation with the ranking member, have authority to strike or revise any provision of the measures ordered reported today that would cause a sequential referral to another committee or that would cause measure to be objected to under Budget Act or Rule 21, Cutco point of order. Without objection, that is so ordered. And pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2L, I ask unanimous consent that all members of the committee have at least 2 calendar days in which to file any supplemental, minority, additional, and dissenting views on the legislation adopted today. Without objection, that is so ordered. Pursuant to Rule 6 of the Rules of the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure, I note the presence of a quorum for actions taken on all committee business today. And with that, I recognize Mr. Larson.
Mr. Chair, just one point of order on this. I think what you concluded at the end will cover this, but on HRes 27, the clerk did announce a 22-30 vote. We believe it was a 24-30 vote, and we just asked the committee staffs to work together to go through the recorded clerk's record to confirm that the vote was 24-30, not 22-30.
That's what we have as well.
Thank you. Thank you. And without objection, I ask unanimous consent that that be done.
Without objection, so ordered. With that, the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure completed its business today, and the committee is adjourned. Thank you, everyone.